Namaste and welcome to AP Talk Time. My name is Thapa. Elections are fundamental and a prerequisite for a democracy, as Nepal is heading for local election on the Friday, the May 13. Nepali voters will have the opportunity to vote for representatives to fill 35,221 local legislative and executive seats. This election is only the second local election since the adoption of the new constitution and transition to federalism. Nepal has taken some positive steps to address significant gaps in women's electoral representation and achieve greater gender equality, but those efforts are not enough. However, women in Nepal continue to face serious barriers to qualitative political representation in politics and leadership as well. What should be done to promote women's political engagement more effectively to enhance their leadership? This question often goes unheard. On today's show, we try to seek some answers. To talk more on this, I am joined by Navanita Sinha, Head of UN Women Nepal. Welcome to Epicenter.
Thank you so much, Sama, for having me.
Thank you for coming here. It's so good to see you. How are things going on with you?
Things are we're going well, and of course we're all talking about the upcoming elections, and in that context talking about women's political representation and participation is key.
So as we are heading for local election 2022, can you please give us an overview of women's political representation in Nepal? What's your insight?
Sama, I think first and foremost we do need to recognize that in Nepal's political history, women have always made very significant contributions. And some of the literature actually dates back to the mid-1880s. And when you look at the prism of modern history, again, whether it's the decade of the 1950s, the 1990s, the People's Movement, women have always been central to political movements and political engagements. Of course, in recent times, as you rightly mentioned, it is with the promulgation of the new constitution and the 2017 elections that appear as a watershed moment in history, and for several reasons. First and foremost, of course, the constitution provided for 1/3 reservation of women, and in the 2017 elections we saw more than 30% women occupy leadership positions in all 3 tiers of government. The second, of course, is especially in the local, at the local level, more than 14,000 women, which they constituted 41% of elected leaders, were elected in the 2017 election, and of these 6,500 were from the Dalit community. So that again is historic, not just in the context of Nepal, but also globally. And we also saw a very significant moment when we had 3 women occupy key decision-making positions following the 2017 election. So we had the President, we had the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and we had the Chief Justice. And as I mentioned, Nepal in that sense provides a strong example for women's representation in public office and is an outlier in many senses. If you look at global data currently, and I'm sort of talking about data from the Interparliamentary Union from early 2022, there are only 11 countries that have a female head of state, and Nepal is one of them. At the same time, we also know that as we celebrate these significant achievements, there are gaps. As you spoke about women's representation, we've seen significant advances, and at the same time, perhaps women's access to decision making is limited. So even in 2017, not more than 3% women were elected as mayors.
Exactly. Despite these glorious facts, we've seen women's representation in powerful roles, with women president. We've seen women as a speaker, as a chief justice, but still we don't trust women's credibility.
Right.
How do you see this going?
I think the answer to that question is rather difficult because despite the historic gains that we have seen in Nepal, you're absolutely right that women are still not seen as credible leaders. And in the work that we do as UN Women, we engage very closely with elected women. And this is a common narrative where they talk about their struggles of also establishing their identity and credibility. And it goes back to the deep-seated inequalities that exist in our society, where again women perhaps are not seen as natural leaders. When you talk about leadership, the image that comes to our mind is that of a male. And that is where the most difficult struggles are, especially when you look at women assuming political office and entering public space. Our mindsets perhaps have not changed at the same level, and women are still not being recognized as credible leaders, as legitimate leaders. And that's why we need to continue to find ways of promoting and creating opportunities for women's meaningful representation and leadership. So it goes back to the underlying norms, and it's not just the public domain, looking at our families, our communities. Gender inequalities exist, and what we see in the political domain is a manifestation of these deep-seated inequalities.
Well, talking about women representation, there is always an ongoing debate that we've seen women just in numbers. So still we lack the qualitative representation. How do you see this? Do we lack qualitative representation? Are we just there in numbers?
So I would like to sort of answer this question at two levels. I think looking at the experience of Nepal and from other countries, when you talk about political accountability to women's rights, women's representation is key. So we have to acknowledge the opportunities that have been created with the 2015 Constitution, and the fact that we've had reservation, which when we speak about affirmative action, reservation is a key tool. It has enabled historic levels of women's representation. So I think we need to acknowledge the importance of having women in public office. At the same time, it is only the first step. And we need to do much more to convert women's political representation into meaningful participation and leadership. And that's where our efforts have to focus on, that how do we continue to support these women who have, at least in the 2017 election, there were several women who assumed leadership for the first time. They entered public office for the first time. So how do we continue to support and work with them to ensure that they're able to also participate meaningfully and exhibit substantive leadership? So that should be a focus going forward.
What is your observation? What are some key learning on women's political representation in the past 5 years here in Nepal?
One, as I said, would be to recognize the importance of affirmative actions such as reservation for, and how instrumental it is for women's representation. And I think what we saw in 2017 was also very strong political will to then implement the constitutional commitments into action. So political will is very, very critical. You can have strong policies and laws, but for it to be implemented, you need strong political will, and that is what we saw in 2017. The second, of course, is, as you rightly mentioned, that we have to go beyond numbers and create opportunities for women's substantive participation and leadership. And that is something that we've also witnessed in the last 5 years. In terms of the different ways in which women have also experienced challenges once they've assumed public office. I think one important lesson is also to recognize that, especially from the 2017 elections, that women's experiences at different levels were different. So for instance, when you look at women at the ward level, their experiences and their struggles were very different from perhaps those who were deputy mayors. So we need to understand the challenges and the barriers women are facing at different levels, and that would be very, very important to be able to then ensure that our strategies are effective and they are actually responding to those different barriers. The second, I think, important lesson learned is also to recognize the diversity amongst women. So, as I mentioned, there is a strong commitment to gender equality and social inclusion. And we've done a research recently where again Dalit women leaders have spoken of very different kinds of barriers and very different kinds of challenges. So that is very important, being able to recognize the diversity amongst women. When we often talk about women as a homogeneous group, and I think it's important to challenge that and really look at how different groups of women, especially those from excluded groups, what their experiences are. This study that we have done also shows that, for instance, in the when there are experiences of discrimination and violence, Dalit women struggle to actually access formal channels of remedy more than other women. So these would be some of the issues that one has to look at in terms of also, as I mentioned, breaking down and understanding the differences amongst and the diversity within women. And the third lesson, I think, going back to your earlier question about women not being seen as credible leaders, but I think in the last 5 years, at least the work that we have done and in our engagement with women leaders, we have seen women change that narrative, and really make a difference once they have assumed public office. So whether it is, when you look at the work that women have done, for instance, as deputy mayors in their role as chairpersons of the judicial committees, they have, there are several examples of how significant women's leadership has been to enable women's access to services. Not just in judicial committees, in other committees as well at the local level, there are some very, very strong examples of women's leadership. The second thing that again, sort of is probably emerging from the experiences of women in Nepal is the ways in which they're creating spaces for diverse voices, including for grassroots women's organizations to engage with processes of local governance. And the third is, again, their attempts and their leadership in creating or formulating laws and policies that address, or promote gender equality. So from that perspective, again, women have really changed the narrative. They are really looking at creating and claiming space and addressing the barriers that we have been speaking about in different ways. So those would be some of the sort of key lessons that have emerged from the last 5 years. And I think just in terms of the, we did talk about how significant Nepal's commitment is to women's leadership. And at the same time, one thing that we need to remember, which I think COVID has taught us, is that hard-won gains can be reversed very quickly. And that's why we need to secure these hard-won gains. And we need to ensure that we are not complacent with these achievements and we continue to work towards promoting women's leadership.
Absolutely. We've seen extraordinary women's leadership as well. I've met many mayors and deputy mayors, women mayors and deputy mayors. They're doing their job very well. I think they are very credible. But whenever we talk about leadership, as you rightly mentioned, an image comes, a male image comes. So that's very deep rooted in our mind, or that begins from our home as well. Right. Whenever we talk about leadership, it's always men in the house. So how do we change these deep seated bias? How do we cure this?
So this is the most complex issue, right? And it's not just with regard to women's political participation and leadership.
Overall women's leadership, it's everywhere.
It touches all aspects of our lives, right? And it starts from our families and our households. Even for, if you look at some of the data around decision making, women still do not have the, within households are not able to take decisions that affect their own lives, right? And that itself, that data itself is quite telling. And this kind of inequality then permeates into other institutions. So when, whether it's in the community, whether it's in, when it comes to women's access to markets, or whether it's in the context of women's engagement in the public domain, these barriers remain. So for us, therefore, when we talk about gender equality, we have to ensure that we are consistently and at different levels working to transform these biases, these perceptions, these stereotypes, and therefore we have to work at all levels, right? So even for women's political participation, we can't just limit our engagement to those who are political actors. We have to start from the family. We have to ensure that communities also recognize the value of women and their leadership, and simultaneously then look at women's engagement at the public level. So for us, it has to be a sustained effort where we engage with multiple stakeholders and across institutions, because this is really what continues to perpetuate gender inequality, and one manifestation of that is that we still do not see women as legitimate leaders.
Talking about women's representation in political party, I think every party looks like a highly centralized institution run by men. How do we tackle this uphill battle to ensure more women in politics? Each and every political parties are run by men, basically. Women are there, but they're not allowed to raise their voice. So it's a very uphill battle to ensure women's participation. How do you see this?
If you look at the data, of course, women's, even within the key national parties, women's access to decision making is limited. And I think we've still not been able to ensure even 1/3 representation of women in decision making, including the central committees. So that clearly is, again, in terms of women's access to decision making, that is an important data point for us to reference when we talk about women's leadership in general. In that context, I think again it has to be, we have to go back to the point that I mentioned earlier about political will. It is important that, in line with the constitutional commitments, women's leadership is also secured within political parties, and that would mean to have women in central committees. That would be critical. At the same time, the larger organizational culture, which remains very masculine, which remains patriarchal, has to change. And for that, there has to be an organizational shift and our organizations and institutions have to become more gender sensitive, and that includes political parties. And the third would be to look at creating mechanisms for accountability. So in the context, for instance, violence against women, including violence against women in politics, we need to ensure that there are redressal mechanisms, there are stronger mechanisms that demonstrate accountability at the highest level to address these issues. So again, it has to be at multiple levels, and hopefully then our goal of gender equality will be realized. These could be some strategies that we could look at in the short to medium term.
For this local election, there are several women competing for mayor, deputy mayor, or in several other key posts. How do you see this? What are some of the positive takeaways from this election, in your personal opinion? Are you following the local election campaign?
Yes, I am, of course. I think that, like I mentioned, I think the most important takeaway or something that has also emerged from our interactions with women political leaders is, despite the challenges, they want to continue in politics. And we've spoken to so many women who are deputy mayors who want to aspire for, not just the position of mayor, but look at provincial assemblies or, look at engagement in the at the national level. So that is, I think, extremely, extremely positive, and something for us to, build on. That women, despite the challenges, have really claimed the space, and we need to continue to focus on creating conditions for their meaningful participation and leadership. So the onus cannot just be on women themselves. We have to also create an enabling environment, and for that, different stakeholders, so from the government to civil society to political parties to families and communities, all of us have to make efforts and create those spaces.
But still, politics has become a masculine sphere. There are a lot of power involved, money involved, a connection with business houses. So where do women fit here? What is your suggestion to aspiring women leaders?
I think in terms of also, when we look at women's leadership, there is often an assumption that women don't have the capacities. That's often the starting point, that women don't have the capacities for leadership. And that is something that we have to challenge. Because
they have the capacity to lead, but often capacity is misunderstood with masculine power,
absolutely,
money, and the other connections.
Absolutely. So I think even with the 2017 elections and this research that I was referring to, something very interesting has come out of it. So this assumption that women don't have capacities, also because perhaps, as I mentioned, many women perhaps assumed public office for the first time. That does not mean a lack of capacity. Our research is showing us that most women who were elected to public office have several years of experience in both political and social engagement at the community level, at the local level. And that is something we need to recognize. That women also bring their own strengths and their own experiences when they come into positions of power. And what we have seen is that even, and this is something that I remember because one elected women representative spoke about how sometimes not being literate is such a barrier, and she said that something very important in terms of how we should re-look at leadership. She said perhaps the most important competency for leadership is not education. It is our ability to understand and respond to the issues of the community. And she spoke about how she focuses, for her leadership is about building relations. It's about ensuring and creating trust with her constituents and finding ways to bring in diverse voices. So I think again from all these women and what their stories tell us is that there are very distinct ways in which women demonstrate leadership, and we need to also acknowledge the strengths that they bring, the capacities and the experiences that they bring when they assume public office.
We've almost come to an end. Do you recommend any enabling environment for inclusive and gender equal representation in politics for women?
So it has to be again at different levels. First and foremost, I think really ensuring, and Nepal has been very strong in demonstrating its commitments to women's political leadership and representation. So ensuring implementation of the constitution and legal provisions is key. And we have to continue to ensure that all stakeholders, including political parties, adhere to these constitutional commitments. The second, of course, has to be in terms of institutional cultural change. We spoke about it, and perhaps again that conversation has to start within political parties. So whether it's in the context of giving women tickets, whether it's in the context of campaign financing, that's again a huge barrier for women, or it's women's access to decision making like the central committees. These would be important ways in which political parties can also demonstrate their commitment to gender equality by addressing some of these institutional bottlenecks and barriers. And the third would of course have to be when we are talking about underlying discriminatory practices and stereotypes, we have to work with different institutions, including families. Families of women who are in political office, families of women who want to aspire to political office, with the communities, and of course with other stakeholders. So we have to engage with different institutions, and we have to engage with men also in more strategic way, so that they can also become allies in our quest for gender equality.
Do you see these all as a challenge? How critical is this?
These are most critical because if we have to bring about sustainable change, we have to transform these. It's all about perceptions,
also
biases,
the
and mindsets.
Deep-rooted mindset are very, very
absolutely
hard.
Because, like you also mentioned, till women are recognized as credible leaders, till women are seen as leaders in their own right, we will unfortunately not be able to move beyond numerical representation to making women's leadership and women's participation in governance more substantive and meaningful. So transforming these norms, these perceptions, these biases is absolutely critical and has to be done at different levels.
Do you recommend any idea or any takeaway to women out there who are aspiring to be leaders? It's often said women or girls, they show a confidence gap when leadership opportunities arise. Do you agree with this, or it's because of the environment out there, the setup are different for women?
I think you've answered the question yourself. And this again is something that we've heard from women leaders.
Yeah.
That there is a struggle to even establish their own self-identity.
Exactly.
And it goes back to our, again, it goes back to the way in which girls are brought up. The opportunities that girls are given within families, and the fact that again when it comes to decision making, when it comes to autonomy, perhaps women still don't have the same rights. So we have to continue to support women, and therefore building confidence, building their sense of identity, and creating ways to support their leadership is important. And we also have to support women as role models and have more women as role models. I think that always contributes to also bringing about positive change. So the more women we have in public office, perhaps the next generation will also aspire for public service and for engagement in politics, and that hopefully will trigger a larger process of change. So starting from the work that we have to do within our families, within educational institutions, and then of course when it comes to women's engagement in public office. So our strategies have to be at different levels. They have to be longer term, because these changes will not happen overnight. So we have to continue to work towards it in a sustained manner and ensure that these commitments are
Absolutely. There has been some progress, though slow and uneven, but still there are tremendous progress. But still I question myself, why is this still an issue in 2022? Why are we still talking about women leadership? Why we are still doubting the credibility of a women leader? Why in this era? Do you question it?
It's a question that makes us all sad, and it is our truth. And it's not just in the context of Nepal. No country in the world has achieved gender equality. And there is some very interesting and data which also makes you uncomfortable, that it's going to take us at least another 130 years to have gender equality in decision making. So that's how deep seated our biases are. That's how deep rooted inequalities are. And once again, I think it's important to look at inequalities also in its intersecting forms. So ensure that we are recognizing how women, especially from different groups, are experiencing these discriminations, as we look at addressing and transforming these underlying barriers.
Absolutely. It's better to clean the dirt rather than hiding inside the carpet or down the carpet. Thank you so much for talking to us. It's really, really
Thank you so much.
Inspiring to see and witness your opinions and thought. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Sama, for having me.
That was Navanita, head of Human Women Nepal, talking about women's representation in politics. See you again.